We find our study today in 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. We'll be looking at a longer section than we usually do in our individual videos. We want to look at the first 16 verses of 1 Timothy chapter 5. As we've noted earlier in our studies, we're going to learn one thing when we look at these three epistles together, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, where Paul is instructing these men, or should we say the Holy Spirit is instructing these men through the Apostle Paul of what their role as a preacher of the gospel will look like. We see that primarily, at least, not exclusively, but primarily, their role as a gospel preacher consists of their relationship and their duties toward the local church. Here he deals with their treatment of some of the members of that local church. Let's just begin in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1, where the apostle says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, the younger men as brothers, the older men as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity." Here he breaks down generally, basically everyone who would make up a local congregation, and tells Timothy, as a gospel preacher, here's how you to treat everybody in the congregation. And let's begin with this word rebuke. This is not the normal word for rebuke that just simply means to correct. This is a word that means to treat harshly. And so he's telling Timothy that you don't treat people harshly. Now there is one question: does this "do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father," that negative and then positive, does that negative apply to all of the positives that follow? In other words, by ellipsis, we might say, is he really saying do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father? Do not rebuke a younger man, but exhort him as a brother? Do not rebuke older women, but exhort them as mothers? Do not rebuke younger women, but exhort them as sisters? I think an argument can be made that he's saying do not treat harshly anybody. But here's how you exhort them. You encourage them. If they're older men, you treat them as you would your father. If they're younger men, you treat them as you would your brothers. The older women, you treat them as you would your mothers. And the younger women as you would your sisters. And you do all of this treatment with the purity that is demanded by being a child of God. And so the preacher is not to abuse his position, to take what is allowed, and that is a proper rebuke and exhortation, and let it escalate to what is not allowed, and that is a harsh treatment of someone. But you remember that they are people. And more importantly, you remember that they're God's children and your family. Now he goes from this to a specific instance of treating members, particular members of a local congregation, when he says, beginning in verse 3, "Honor widows who are really widows." I'm reading in the New King James, and this idea of widows and really widows demands just a little bit of an examination before we go further. Every one of us understands the classic definition of a widow. It's a woman who has lost her husband. But Paul isn't going to talk just about that classic, what we might call clinical dictionary definition of widows, of someone who has lost their husband. But he's going to talk about this concept of those who are really widows, or One translation says widows indeed. The concept of someone being an indeed or really a widow takes it further than they've simply lost their husband. Now, Timothy is not cold-hearted. He's not saying that someone who's lost their husband deserves no sympathy or feelings. But what he's talking about here is not just sympathy or feelings toward, but he's going to talk about financial support of. And so in this context, we're going to see someone who is really a widow is someone who has not only lost their husband, but has no other means of financial support. And so let's see that. Verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. So here's someone who is a widow by this first definition, that is, someone who has lost their husband, but because they have other family members who can and should step up and support them financially, then they do not meet this second definition of being really widows, or widows who don't have that support system. Verse 5, now she who is really a widow, and again that's defined here in verse 4, it's one who does not have children or grandchildren who can financially help her. She who is really a widow and left alone. So there's another definition of what a really a widow means. She's not just lost her husband, but she literally has no one that she can turn to, no family member or loved one who will step up and show piety and repay and to support this person. So she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers day and night. So here's some further definitions, or we might say qualifications, of this widow who is left alone, but also now, he adds to the list, meets certain spiritual and religious qualifications. She trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers day and night. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And so here's someone who would not meet this qualification of a widow who is worthy of the local church's financial help and support. She is if she trusts in God and prays night and day, but she is not worthy of that support if she lives in pleasure. He cautions Timothy, and these things command, that they may be blameless, that these widows may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, verse 8 says, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This anyone who is to provide for his own seems to take us back to verse 4, to the children and the grandchildren. We might sometimes take this verse, 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, and make an application, what we might say, down the family tree, that we are to support our children and provide for our children that are living in our home. And certainly that would be the case. But here in the context, this providing for our own and for our own household is, again, going up the family tree of our mother or our grandmother who may be left alone and needs our support. And so here is how we, as children and grandchildren, how we learn piety. How do we learn to show piety at home and to repay our parents? This, verse 8, is how we do it. we provide for our own, especially those of our household, because if we don't, we've denied the faith and we're worse than an unbeliever. Strong language for someone who would allow one of their family members to do without and to suffer because they're unwilling to provide for them, to show piety, and to repay their parents. And so it is first the individual's obligation to take care of a family member. Verse 9 then reads, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she be the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she's diligently followed every good work." This reminds us a little bit of the qualifications that Paul had given Timothy earlier for those who would serve as shepherds in the local church. Here, though, he gives these qualifications if a widow who meets the qualifications or the definitions of being really a widow, as he's lined them out earlier, that if they're to be supported financially on an ongoing basis, that there's some qualifications here. The first thing that he tells us is that if they have family members, let the family members take care of them first. But now he is saying the church is only to be burdened with helping those who meet these religious, spiritual qualifications. Verse 11, and so we would assume that if certain qualifications must be met, that there would be those who would not meet those qualifications and therefore should not be financially supported on a long-term basis. And he addresses that in verse 11, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith." And so he had said under 60 years of age, they're not to be taken into the role of those who would be regularly supported by the local church. And here he states a reason why. Because those younger women need to marry. That a temptation might arise if these younger women are not married, don't have a means of support, that maybe the church shouldn't support them because of the temptation that might arise. Verse 13, he continues, "And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows," here is someone who has lost their mate, but doesn't meet the qualifications of being really a widow that he's lined out before. And so here's the advice for the younger widows, that they marry, bear children, and manage the house, and give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. That opportunity for the adversary, for Satan to speak against them, is by being engaged in these sinful practices that he's mentioned earlier. And Paul says that not only could that be the case, but it's already been the case, for some, verse 15, have already turned aside after Satan. And so this summary statement is given in verse 16. "If any believing man or woman has widows," again, we'd refer you back to verse 4. "If any believing man or woman, any child or grandchild of a widow, let them relieve them." And here we would refer you back to verse 8. "If If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so if a believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Those who, number one, don't have anyone else who would financially support them. And secondly, those who meet those spiritual qualifications that he's outlined in this text. We learn a couple lessons, big picture lessons from this text. Number one is there's a difference between the individual's money and the money that belongs to the local church. There are things that I can do with my money as an individual that the church has not been burdened with. Another big picture lesson is that obviously one of the primary missions and goals of the New Testament church is not to be a financial institution, not even to be a charitable institution. We're to engage in that charity, but this text and other texts like it in the New Testament impress upon us that charity is limited. The primary work of the local church is for the edification of its members and the evangelism to the lost. And when these needs arise among their own members, that we are to step up and to be charitable, but only if these widows cannot be supported by an existing family member, and only if they meet these spiritual requirements. And so we want to challenge you today. Who in your family, or maybe even in your broader circle, needs your support and your help? If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.